The Marine Corps requires leaders of all ranks to have a deep understanding of war and the employment of force. MCDP 1 reminds Marines that the military profession is a thinking profession. Every Marine is expected to be a student of the art and science of war. It goes on to say that every Marine has an individual responsibility to study the profession of arms. Self-directed study in the art and science of war is at least equal in importance to maintaining physical condition and should receive at least equal time. The Marine Corps Association understands the critical importance of ensuring that Marines are as mentally ready for combat as they are physically ready. That is why we offer an entire page dedicated to wargaming on our website. We have recommendations for both tabletop board games as well as computer games. And for Marine Corps Association members, there is a discount code for War Game Design Studios that you can find on the website. War games are a great way to immerse yourself in history and to put yourself in the shoes of the great leaders of history. Go beyond guided instruction and experience the thrill of wargaming. Check us out at mca-marines.org/decision-making-exercises/wargaming-2. That's mca-marines.org/decision-making-exercises/wargaming-2. Take your training to the next level. Hey, Scuttlebutt listeners. Thank you for joining us and your continued support. This week, we continued our Road to 250 segment, celebrating the Marine Corps' 250th birthday in 2025. Over the next year, we'll feature stories and history from throughout the 250 years of the Marine Corps. These episodes will be nested within the MCA's overall Road to 250 campaign, where you find featured articles in both the Gazette and Leatherneck highlighting events and battles within specific periods in Marine Corps history. The MCA also has a commemorative Road to 250 coin collection. These commemorative challenge coins can only be found through the MCA. Go to marineshop.net to order individual coins or email customer service at mca-marines.org to order the entire set or learn more. For June, we walked the Road to 250 with Gazette and Leatherneck Editor-in-Chief, Colonel Chris Woodbridge. Colonel Woodbridge talks to us about the significance of the interwar period, the impact of the global crises of the time, and how this period shaped the future trajectory of the Marine Corps. This is episode 197. Hey, Scuttlebutt listeners. Thank you for joining us and your continued support. I'm Vic. I'm here with William.
Howdy, y'all.
And this week we are doing another segment of our Road to 250 series where we explore the various sort of generational periods throughout Marine Corps history leading up to the 250th birthday coming up in this November. And on this week, part of this episode, we will be exploring the interwar period. That is the period between World War I and World War II. And to help us walk this road, we have the Gazette and Leatherneck Editor-in-Chief, Colonel Chris Woodbridge. Sir, thank you for being here.
Awesome. Thanks very much.
Yeah, so this was an interesting sort of lead up because there were some very obvious periods that we had in the previous segments of the series. And then obviously we have a very obvious one coming up here in July. But the interwar periods, we were all kind of scratching our heads. And I'll just go ahead and lean into my own ignorance this period, that really my only context for this time was in the HBO series, The Pacific. And in particular, them highlighting John Basilone and how he was, essentially using antiquated equipment with sort of also antiquated doctrine leading into their deployment into the Pacific and to fight a modern war with really knowledge going back to the trench warfare of the French, in France and in Europe. So So what are the interwar period? Like what are we talking about here, and why is this significant as we look at the Marine Corps' history?
So in the most basic terms, the interwar period is that time from the end of World War I, 1918, November 11th, as we all know, through a kind of sliding bookend on the other side. Some folks define it as the beginning of World War II. So 1939 in Europe, even though the United States was not involved at that point, and war had not really officially been declared, would soon be declared in Europe.
And the French in particular, like I'm just thinking like the Maginot Line. So most militaries were still stuck in that old sort of
right, and that brings up a great point about what lessons were learned from World War I. But to kind of bookend the thought, some other scholars, historians, students of military affairs, bookend the interwar period with the entry of the U.S. into World War II after Pearl Harbor. So sometime between 39 and 41 being the end of the interwar period. But of note for the Marine Corps, just as today, there really aren't many lulls in the action. There aren't interwar pauses.
Right. It wasn't Libo.
Exactly. And at the same time, the Marine Corps is subject to many of the other pressures that the other services are, as in drawdowns in end strength, reduction in funding, but not necessarily a reduction in what they were doing. So to kind of set the global stage during this period, a couple of really big 100-weight events. The first one followed immediately after, actually started during the last year of World War I, and that was the influenza epidemic of 1918-1919, commonly referred to as the Spanish flu, because the first identified cases of it were in Spain during 1918. But that was a global pandemic, first of the modern era. And just to sort of give a frame of reference, so in 2 years, 1918, 1919, about 50 million people died worldwide of the Spanish flu. To compare that to our own experiences of COVID-19, up through the end of or the beginning of 2024, which is sort of when tracking stopped or started to be less prominent, about 7 million people died worldwide. Oh, by the way, the population that 7 million and 50 million came out of is very, very different. Right. So the devastating effects of that influenza epidemic at the end of World War I really can't be overstated, because it influenced many, many things, to include the overall isolationism globally of countries sort of turning inward, again, in the wake of World War I, in the wake of this disease epidemic, and sort of concentrating internally, not engaging broadly. The second major 100-weight historic event, obviously, was the Great Depression of 1929 to 1939. So roughly 10 years of full economic collapse, not just in the United States, but globally, felt more in developed countries like the United States, industrial countries, than in other parts of the world. There's actually, and depending on where you were in the United States, a writer of kind of modern American Gothic novels named Harry Crews said that in Bacon County, Georgia, in 1929 until 1939, nobody noticed there was a Great Depression because the area was so rural and so underdeveloped, underserved to begin with. So depending on where you sat, it was a very different experience. But economically, the world collapsed, which also created this environment of isolationism. And then obviously the end of World War I, the experience of World War I, different for some countries than others. You mentioned France earlier. It's hard to grapple with 13 million killed. That's not even the total That's one battle, the Battle of Verdun. Again, the lessons coming out of that, in some cases, were we just don't want to ever have to do that again. Mm-hmm. In other cases, we could do that and win, or we can defend ourselves in the event that this happens again. And so that sort of shapes the military overview of what lessons came out of World War I and how did different nations apply them. You mentioned the Maginot Line. The primary example of the French learning experience from World War I was to make a better defensive line, an impregnable line of fortifications, deliberate fortifications. And let's think of this in modern terms of, organize, train, and equip. So you organize your infantry, your ground forces into what were called fortress infantry, divisions, regiments, battalions. And they manned and lived, permanently underground in reinforced concrete, stone, earthwork fortifications that stretched essentially from the Ardennes, the forest on the borders of Belgium, almost completely down into Alsace-Lorraine and the Swiss border. Most heavily fortified, adjacent to Germany. Right. Obviously, again, a lesson learned. Where did they come the last time? Well, let's build all our fortifications there. And the 2020 hindsight of history is very clear in that if you build an immovable object, the irresistible force will just go around it, which is essentially the story of the opening days of the Second World War, which leads to what Germany learned from World War I. And much of their experience centered around tactical and operational learning about attacking in depth and using combined arms. And so as technology advanced, the ability to enhance combined arms using service-delivered fires, armor, mechanized infantry, and air led to this capability for doing attacks in depth,
blitzkrieg,
as a counter to defense in depth. The other experiences in other nations varied greatly. There was a good snapshot of that. Maybe the different approaches different nations took to armor. So World War I saw the first use of tanks by the Germans and the British primarily. The French developed some. The U.S., once they got to France, used some French tanks. But very, very different employment, very different tactical use. Essentially tanks as trench busters, so an armored vehicle that can breach a trench or cross a trench physically. And you look at the design of some of these vehicles, why in the world would you put your artillery, your main guns and your machine guns on the sides of a vehicle, not the front of it? Well, when you park that vehicle on a trench line perpendicular to it, you can now fire those weapons up and down the long axis. And you built a very specific tool for a very specific tactical environment, trench warfare. Following the war, different nations took different approaches to what the tank could potentially offer. Interestingly, the British took and perhaps this isn't that surprising given the power of Britain, on the waves, took a very naval approach to developing tanks. So battleship tanks, cruiser tanks, light, medium, heavy tanks as an approach. The Germans, on the other hand, with a doctrine underpinning everything, looked at tanks as part of that combined arms team. Mobile, shock, and firepower, not to work in isolation or in its own formations, but as support and part of the infantry formation. So a different approach there. The U.S. very slow off the mark in this.
Because we didn't really even start getting into tank development and acquisition until we started looking at going into North Africa, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Really the 1930s. But interestingly, the U.S. Army leading this looked at essentially reorganizing its cavalry recognizing, again, from the experience of World War I, that horse cavalry, probably not the way of the future, at least not in major combined arms warfare. Started retooling cavalry formations and particularly using high-performing cavalry officers to lead the effort to modernize that capability using armor. But that really didn't start to grow, again, because of the Depression and the lack of resources until there was a need really in the 1930s.
Because the thing about the Great Depression that affected our modernization efforts were that the tech giants of the time, the DuPonts and the Fords were all the ones that suffered so greatly from the Great Depression. So they weren't looking to innovate.
That's absolutely true. In some cases, they were purely looking to cut their losses or look for lower cost alternatives.
Right. And J.P. Morgan's not handing out loans for these guys to do R&D.
No. And we might be jumping the gun a little bit, but you mentioned the Army's experience with tanks World War I. Was there a Marine experience with tanks World War I? And I know the interwar period was a period of great practicing, trying new ideas, experimentation from the Marine Corps. Was armor involved in that at all?
To my knowledge, no. The Marine brigade in France fought as an infantry brigade, combined arms to the point of having machine gun battalions. So, again, huge advancement in terms of automatic small arms fire or automatic weapons fire. And also, a clear recognition learned from the French experience of the power of an automatic weapon on the battlefield. Until you've experienced that, it's very nothing talks louder than an automatic weapon in a tactical fight, and it has to be addressed. When you look at the play of so many small tactical engagements from the trenches of France to the streets of Fallujah and Marja, when the enemy has an automatic weapon that has you in its kill zone, in its beaten zone, you have to address that. That stops all other plans until that's silenced. Mm-hmm. And other tools get developed to respond to that. Small grenade launchers, hand grenades, rocket launchers, rocket rifle propelled grenades, rocket propelled grenades were all developed as a way to address the power of the automatic weapon on the battlefield. That tactical lesson was clear to the Marine Corps. And when you look at force development through the interwar period, the Marine Corps was looking at pushing more and lighter automatic weapons down to what would become the fire team level.
So unlike the Army was looking to get bigger, we were looking to find a way to be more mobile.
Yes, and that'll very much figures into kind of the Marine experience of World War I and other experiences during the interwar period that drove the approach to the future. Some other key points about the global setting at the time. Again, just because of the way World War I played out, people tend to focus in looking at Europe almost exclusively. But important to note that Japan was on the winning side of World War I.
That's right.
They were allied to Britain and the United States and France, and so essentially came out as a card holder in 1918.
Yeah, we were having Japanese officers coming to our schools.
Exchanges, military exchanges, civilian exchange throughout our education system and industry. The Japanese took a very brilliantly deliberate approach to modernizing. They looked at the rest of the world and said, okay, who has the best army? Who has the best navy? We're going to send our officers to learn how they do things. So they went to Britain for their naval experience, and they went to Germany and France for their military experience, their army, ground, land forces experience. Unfortunately, in some cases, that also brought back political philosophies and views. And so the interwar period in Japan saw a series of really internal coups, that led to a military government, a military dictatorship with the royal family, the emperor, as a very much a figurehead, but also, not surprisingly, based on the way they were educated, saw a divide, a rift between the army, the Imperial Japanese Army, and its leadership, and the Imperial Japanese Navy and its leadership. And where that would come to play out is essentially the naval leadership ran the war in the Pacific. Mm-hmm. So really from what we today would call the first island chain, beyond the Philippines out through the islands of the Micronesia, Polynesia, and all the way to Hawaii and California. Japanese Army, on the other hand, the Imperial Army ran the war in China, Southeast Asia, up to New Guinea, and into Burma. And so that was the Imperial Army running that theater, if you will. And they competed for resources, and they fought each other internally over decisions regarding resources throughout the war. The other, we talked about Asia, Southeast Asia, China. Important to know, China, our major player in the world today, at that time was essentially governed by regional warlords. And as time went on from the early 1920s through the late 1930s, those regional warlords were gradually subdued or absorbed by the two main warlords, one being communist, Mao Zedong, and the other being nationalist, some would say fascist, Chiang Kai-shek. Mm-hmm. So early in the development of the nationalist Chinese army, very closely aligned with Germany, Italy, and Spain, Franco's Spain. So very fascist in its approach, but ultimately our U.S. connection to the Civil War in China.
And not to get too sidetracked, but where was Australia in this? I know that one of the big sort of banners that Australian military will fly is that they fought with us alongside us in every single where was Australia positioned? And obviously it was a jump off point for the island hopping campaign, but in the interwar period were they also modernizing?
So no, Australia it's a little simplified, but in the interwar period, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa were all part of the Commonwealth, along with a dozen other countries worldwide. Again, the Britain at that point still had an empire, so still had card-carrying colonies, and then meaning they were governed by Britain,
right,
out of the colonial office, and then also had a Commonwealth of pseudo-locally governed territories, Australia, New Zealand, Canada being the main three, but throughout the Pacific, Fiji,
right,
throughout Africa. If you look at a map from Cairo to Cape Town, all British colonies and Commonwealth, one railroad running the whole way, built by Britain. So they at that time were still very much the global power. And really, as we move through the interwar period and certainly move through the Second World War, that would change. But let's kind of focus in a little bit more on the Marine experience. Yeah. So I think the two things that the Marines took away from World War I was the first time the Marine Corps ever did a national mobilization and literally expanded 300-fold. So where you had 10 Marines, you now have 300, and they were volunteers. There was not a draft at the time. They were equipped and trained at Parris Island and Quantico. The first time the Marine Corps moved out of naval barracks or barracks on naval bases or shipyards. So, the Marine Barracks Brooklyn was in the Brooklyn shipyard. Marine Barracks Philadelphia, the Philadelphia shipyard. Those were the only land holdings the Marine Corps had. And it was really just a place to account for, rest, and train Marines before you put them back out on ships or sent them to one of our holdings, Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico at the time. Those were overseas Marine presence, semi-permanent or rotational, we'd call it today, or sending them to the crisis du jour in a place of economic importance to the United States, specifically the Caribbean and Central America.
And the Marines still had embassy duty, because I'm thinking like Boxer Rebellion, like still had embassy duty at this time.
Yes, Marines provided the security guards at U.S. embassies, obviously a very different construct at the time, but all over the world. And so the Marine experience of the interwar period really falls into one or more of three buckets. The experience coming out of World War I, mobilizing enormous, never before seen number of Marines to be deployed to France and to fight in that Marine brigade. Again, very infantry-centric, machine gun-centric, trench fighting experience. Or to fall into the small wars bucket, or using the terminology of the time, the banana wars bucket. Again, Central America and the Caribbean as an example there. And then the third bucket were the Marines who had done many of those other things, but started looking ahead to the future and what the Marine Corps might be called on to do and what role it might fill in some larger, different world, different conflict.
Like a futures division?
Similar, yes. And it was very much run out of a new organization. Again, Quantico was new, and one of the earliest additions to Quantico was Marine Corps schools. And it was really two officer schools, a junior course and a senior course. And the building still stands here on the other side of campus.
Well, using modern terms, Force Design 2030 describes, the pacing threat. When did Japan become that pacing threat for the Marine Corps as they just started developing their amphibious doctrine, of which they're going to start to figure out where they fit in the bigger picture of America's war plan?
Great question, William. So the driving force behind that, again, because Japan had been our ally in World War I, much of the view there was driven politically by changes in administration from the Wilson administration on, and looking at what Japan was doing. One of the biggest turning points for the U.S. relationship in Japan came in the 1920s and 30s as the Japanese invaded mainland Asia, moving from their colony in Korea and from the Japanese home islands into Manchuria and setting up their own country. Manchuria had been a province of China, Imperial China. Oh, by the way, it was the province where the imperial family of the Qing dynasty, also known as the Manchu dynasty, they came from Manchuria. Invading and setting up a new country, new flag, new government, puppet government under Japanese leadership called Manchukuo. And why did they do that? When you're an island nation with lots of people, what do you need more than anything else? Land and resources. And if you're going to build a war machine of a modern, at that point, early 20th century caliber, what do you need? You need coal, you need steel, you need iron ore. Manchuria and Korea are ripe with those resources. And so this became part of the Japanese and expansionist strategy. The next key event was the pseudo-invasion of China. A brief engineered crisis leads to full Japanese invasion and occupation of China, which is a very, very difficult proposition. To quote the Princess Bride, one of the two, stupidest things you can do is a land war in Asia. And the Japanese Imperial Army discovered this. The only things they had in their favor were first the disorganization and outclassing of really all Chinese forces at the time, except for those those two main warlords who had coalesced essentially the north and western regions of China, and then the south and coastal regions of China, respectively, Mao and Chiang Kai-shek. Mao being supplied and supported to a degree by the Soviets under Stalin, sort of a very uncomfortable but allied relationship there, and then Chiang Kai-shek approaching the West and ultimately becoming the ally of the U.S., supplied, trained, etc. Those were the only real organized resistance to the Japanese. Of course, they did what anyone would do, take the coastal areas, make sure you can move the resources out of the country back to Japan, literally enslave the population. The other thing they had going for them was a complete disregard for human life. Mm-hmm. And so the brutality of the Japanese occupation of China was also part of the turning point in U.S.-Japan relations that certainly indicated them as that pacing threat. The other factor, and this is also very key and unique to the Marine Corps, the Marine Corps in its sort of philosophy or DNA has always, been very much a show me kind of organization. And we'd prefer that the person showing us was one of us. And we had that in Lieutenant Colonel Earl Pete Ellis. Intelligence, we would call him today an intelligence or foreign area officer. But he was dispatched essentially incognito, no longer, he's no longer wearing the Marine uniform, but went all over the Pacific looking at what the Japanese were doing in places like Samoa, in Guam, and other parts of the islands of Polynesia, and essentially wrote a report looking at how Japan was using the land, the islands in the Pacific, to build this chain of logistic support and combat outposts, fortifying islands, and gradually moving further and further to the east towards Hawaii and California and Alaska. And so that report became the foundation of what would be War Plan Orange, which is flip the map around. How would we prosecute a campaign across the Pacific? The Marine Corps, again, not to oversimplify, but the Marine Corps used that as the pacing scenario. And so you now had this third bucket developing, but there was still very much an internal debate. You had Marines, mostly senior veterans of the war in France in World War I, proposing that the future of the Marine Corps would be to fight as a second land army. And so optimize the education, training, equipping of that future Marine Corps to do that.
Landlocked force.
Yes, to fight alongside. Now, you may get there, but at that time, everyone got there on ships.
Right.
So we're going to fight alongside the Army after closing on wherever the war is going on. There was a second camp made up of what we could call the small warriors or the banana warriors, who believed that the future of the Marine Corps would be small unit constabulary actions forever. And you had some very vocal advocates for this. Among other things, they produced what we know today as the Small Wars Manual. Mm-hmm. That was produced here in Marine Corps schools at Quantico as a sort of a monthly serial, little pamphlets every month that were bound together into the both physically and conceptually into the Small Wars Manual, collecting all the lessons learned and thoughts about being that constabulary force, irregular warfare, we would call it today, but certainly a counter-guerrilla force. Mm-hmm. And again, based on those experiences of Central America and the Caribbean. And some of those experiences are absolutely fascinating. The things that the Marine Corps did in places like Nicaragua and Haiti are, from today's standards, even truly remarkable. Every Marine NCO serving in Haiti from the period of 1915 to 1935, was also a officer in the Haitian Gendarmerie, so the Haitian National Police or National Guard. You're a sergeant, you're also a lieutenant. You're a captain, you're also a lieutenant colonel. And everything from their uniforms and their insignia, but they had entire formations of Haitian troops that answered to them, that fell under them. They had translators. Sound familiar? Iraq and Afghan vets. Sure. So very much like our MITs, BITs, police training teams, et cetera, except that Marine lieutenant or gendarmerie lieutenant, Marine a sergeant had full authority over that formation and was given an area of operations and a mission. And one of the most fascinating stories was captured in 1935 in a book called The White King of La Gonâve. Now, La Gonâve is an island that sits right off Port-au-Prince. It's out in Haiti is sort of a crescent-shaped country. It sits right in that bay. And he, as a sergeant, the subject of the book, a Marine sergeant named Faustin Workus. He was a New York City native immigrant from Central Europe, became a sergeant in the Marine Corps, and was given the whole island and a platoon of Haitian gendarmes and told, you have one mission, collect the taxes and keep the peace. Did he have any
Marines to his, or was it just him and these Haitians?
Him and his Haitian troops.
Okay. That's crazy.
And then periodically, every month, a lieutenant or a captain would show up and say, where's the money? Where's the taxes?
Yeah.
And he was able to do that.
It's like something out of like Apocalypse Now.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and the book certainly gets into that. Part of what worked for him, again, his first name was Faustien. In the history of Haiti, there was an emperor under the Napoleonic era called Faustien I. And so he was somehow able to make that connection, and the local voodoo cult adopted him as the leader, and he was able to accomplish his mission with limited amount of kinetic operations involved. Went on, found a ghostwriter in New York City, wrote a book, and of note, that book later in the 50s and 60s turned into countless pulp magazines, gentlemen's lurid magazines about, Marines in Haiti and scantily clad native girls. And those sorts of things.
Savages.
The horror.
But it was very attractive for those reasons and others. It served enormous economic purposes in the United States, which would later prompt General Smedley Butler to do his great diatribe about war as a racket and how he and his Marines had been used by American industry to do their dirty work down in Central America to ensure that United Fruit and Del Monte could get access to the pineapples and bananas and, essentially develop colonies and mistreat the population. But beyond that, there were the believers in the Marine Corps who said that's the future. And then you had the third group who looked at the political environment in Asia, looked at what Ellis had reported and what the Japanese were doing in the Pacific, and said this, at present, is a gap in U.S. capabilities. Circle back around to experience and lessons learned of World War I. World War I also, on the outskirts of Europe, so in Turkey, saw the largest amphibious operation to date at that point, the Gallipoli Peninsula campaign that the British and their Commonwealth troops, New Zealand, Indian, and Australians, along with British troops, prosecuted up the Gallipoli Peninsula. An entire show, an entire study in and of itself. But important to note, different lessons for different people. The British looked at that experience and said,
we're never doing that.
We're never doing that again. Large-scale amphibious operations are impossible. The French were unconcerned. The Germans, largely unconcerned, but wanted to find other ways to do it, exploring airborne troops, glider infantry, those sorts of things. The U.S., particularly the Marine Corps, looked at it and said, this is feasible. This is doable. They focused on the end of the Gallipoli campaign, so the amphibious withdrawal of British forces from the peninsula, from Suvla Bay, and said, that's how you do it, but in reverse. Mm-hmm. The key points there being planning and detailed planning, the development of a level of detail in planning that we would be familiar with later as developing serial assignment tables, landing craft and vehicle assignment tables, helicopter wave assignment tables, the idea that you know where each and every Marine, each and every piece of equipment and ordnance in that landing force is every time you do it, every landing craft, every seat accounted for, every capability accounted for. If you pursue that level of detailed planning, you can do amphibious assaults. And that was all learned based on that experience of Gallipoli, but developed here in Marine Corps schools at Quantico, and would result in, just as you had the Small Wars Manual, you had the tentative manual for landing operations. And so that developed the doctrine that drove, recognizing a gap in our capabilities, the Marine Corps to look to fill that gap.
That's interesting when we look at the lens of modern day, when General Neller said, hey, we can't fight the war as it is. Like, as it stands today, we can't win wars. Or I'm paraphrasing, obviously.
So we are not postured. We are not positioned to defeat a peer threat or a near peer threat,
which was the impetus behind
Force Design 2030. Yeah. Exactly.
So
when he said that, looking at that environment of anti-access and area denial, in a maritime, exactly, in a maritime scenario, the Marine Corps really had only one capability that could add a relevant capability to that fight, and that was the F-35. And even it was not fully capable because of ranges and the fact that its platform can't close. A big deck LHA can't close within that weapons engagement zone without becoming a self-optimized target. So yes, very similar. A lot of parallels really between today's world and then. But that led to the development of the Tentative Landing Force Operations Manual, which drove our amphibious doctrine. And at the same time, pushed the Marine Corps towards what we call today capability development and experimentation. So if we're going to put Marines on ships and go conduct amphibious assaults against defended beaches, what sort of capabilities do we need? Well, we need landing craft first and foremost. So, okay, we need small boats. We need Higgins boats. We need other types of boat-style landing craft. But some of these atolls, as Ellis learned, have coral reefs, and well, we need something with tracks on it. Yeah, and so we discovered these things down in Louisiana that are used in the swamps and bayous to get around. And well, maybe we can make one of those military. And so that then developed the alligator, Roebling's alligator, which in turn evolved into all the Vic's starting to levitate here.
I'm beaming here.
Starting to levitate. The AAV officer developed all of our amphibious tractors. And as World War II would play out, those in turn evolved, again, based on battlefield experience and understanding that threat to the point where you had both heavy direct fire howitzers on amphibious tractors and amphibious tanks with snorkels that could wade ashore or swim ashore in the surf zone. All of that would come into play by the latter years, so Iwo Jima on in World War II. But to kind of circle back and neck this down, what it really points to is the differences between, and the Marine Corps loves, we innovate, we adapt, we overcome. All right, there are differences between innovation, adaptation, and innovation. And probably the best source or the best book to read on that subject and understanding the difference between those activities, those three activities, and understand how they played into the interwar period is a book written in 1996 or published in 1996 by Dr. Williamson Murray, Wick Murray passed away last year. One of the great military historians and military thinkers, I'll say, of the nation, but also of the Marine Corps. Professor of history at Ohio State and also at Marine Corps University, who wrote it with Alan Millett. Again, published in '96, and the book is Military Innovation in the Interwar Period. And it's really a series of essays written and edited by Murray and Millett. And what it lays out is, again, cognitively, there's a difference, and practically there's a difference between innovation, adaptation, and innovation. And so if we look at the Marine experience, what the Marines did really in World War I was certainly adaptation. They adapted very rapidly from being a very small naval raiding and police force to being a second land army, a large formation, brigade level that could fight alongside U.S. Army forces in what we would consider today combined arms trench warfare, and succeed and do very well at that. But that's taking what you already have and changing it slightly. Innovation, some would say, is what the Marine Corps learned and what they did during the Banana Wars. When you innovate, think of improv, improvisation. Think of improv comedy. It's yes and take an idea and then run with it.
Right.
That's very much that sort of improvisation is what the Marine Corps had to do during the Banana Wars. Again, using existing formations, existing capabilities, but discovering that there's a Marine with a first name of Faustien who might be able to talk to these folks on this island and get the taxes collected. Go do some improv, Sergeant. Those are two things. Adaptation and improvisation are the Marine Corps' strong suit. And not just the Marine Corps. In the Army, the Navy can do those activities as well and do them very credibly. But the Marine Corps prides itself on adapting, taking what we have now, changing it slightly to meet a different requirement. Improvisation, taking capabilities, organizations, training that we have, and taking it one step further, using the yes and. Initiative. My own experience in the Philippines as a lieutenant. Hey, you're going to go train and operate with this Filipino Marine platoon. Luckily, I have a corpsman who's from the Philippines, like most platoons do. Speaks the language, so now I have a built-in translator, interpreter, and
cultural expert.
And we improved, right? Cultural expert, and we improved. Both of those activities, as strong as the Marine Corps and other military formations are completely different from innovation. Innovation is not an on-the-fly activity. Innovation is a deliberate approach, studying future requirements, potential future requirements, determining the capabilities needed to fill and accomplish missions in that environment, and then taking a deliberate approach to developing the doctrine, identifying capabilities in training and equipping, in organization, experimenting with those, wargaming those, and then developing that into a fielded capability. That is not just for the Marine Corps, but for all, and it's largely the message of Murray and Millett's book. That is the greatest challenge that all military organizations face. A couple of reasons. Main reason is risk. You have a high probability of being precisely wrong in your assessment of the future environment, in your assessment of the capabilities required, how your force can fill gaps. Huge risk in not getting it right, and the consequences of not getting it right.
As I say, because it's not a blank check.
Never. Yeah. Never. Ultimately, you pay that check in blood and treasure. But in the interim, you can pay that check in career development, career viability when you completely screwed it up, or point out how somebody else screwed it up. Think Billy Mitchell or Captain Trent most recently. So the other risk or the other factor that culturally stands in the way of innovation in military organizations is inherent fear of change and resistance to change. And this is true in the Marine Corps and in every other organization.
I think we saw some of that just a few years ago.
I think we still see it now.
Yeah.
There's a huge attraction to doing what you've always done with more Marines and better equipment. That's not innovation. That's not even adaptation or improvisation. That's really just doubling down on your comfort zone. And so there's a huge tendency in all militaries to do that, but there are also great examples of organizations that have overcome those obstacles. And unfortunately, one of the things that history tells us and that has been identified in this and other books is the number one driving factor for overcoming those obstacles of resistance to change and innovation is a battlefield defeat. Mm-hmm. If you get your ass kicked and you're even remotely competent, you're going to take a step back and start self-assessment and looking at what were we doing that didn't work and what do we need to do to change to be successful. One of the great examples of that from European history is the Prussians in the Napoleonic era. Coming out of the era of Frederick the Great, the Prussians were the prime land power in Europe until they met Napoleon. And then they were roundly defeated, but the difference being the Prussians, and by extension the Germans later, and Germany later, would take that deliberate effort at self-assessment, introspection, study, broad development of military thinkers, creation of organizations exclusively for that study of military theory, tactics, operations, strategy, and developing a cadre of officers who were educated and expert in that, who could then lead the force into the future and learn those lessons and adapt and innovate quickly. So we have not suffered a battlefield defeat. Some people would say we've suffered some strategic defeats over the last few years, but that's not the same as tactical or operational defeat on the battlefield. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, we haven't really suffered that. Unfortunately, if that's the number one tool to overcoming organizational change and resistance to innovation, it may never happen. And we do a lot to hedge against it to ensure it never happens. So short of that, how do you build that environment of assessing the future, making reasonable predictions, developing answers, doctrine, doing experiments, developing new organizations, investing in new equipment. The first step always should be clear identification and agreement about the military problem to be solved. Anti-access, area denial weapons, inability to close the force in traditional ways, the reconnaissance, counter-reconnaissance conundrum of finder versus hider, increased ranges and lethality of weapons. How do we develop? If we agree that that's the military problem, then we can start developing a solution and look at deliberate innovation to meet that problem. If, on the other hand, we don't have clear agreement on what the military problem is, and in the case of the Marine Corps, it's very difficult because no matter what else the Marine Corps does, part of our military problem has to be global crisis response. That's right. It's written into law. That's the DNA of the Marine Corps. And at present, we are less capable in that regard. And the Commandant has identified this in his campaign, if you will, to reestablish continuous MU presence 3.0. So a MU off the East Coast, a MU off the West Coast, episodically deployed MU in Okinawa. That's answering that requirement. That's part of our military problem. while also dedicating resources to modernize, to answer the other change in the environment about how the Marine Corps and the Naval Service fights.
So you got to look at it then. I mean, this is really interesting because I never even thought to look at it through this lens. But I mean, those three buckets you identified during the interwar period are almost mirrored today.
Absolutely. So, the parallels today, and there's a reason I started with talking about the Spanish flu and COVID and economic collapse.
Right.
And also the change in political environment, national strategy environment towards a more isolationist approach. That's today, not just in the U.S., but all over the world. While there are, major wars going on, while there are small wars going on. And so there's enormous parallels. And again, I don't think, the past is certainly prologue. It helps to inform your thinking. And I think if you focus on the most important learning about learning, again, defining the military problem, building clear consensus about that problem, even if it's multifaceted. So how to be present for global crisis response while modernizing the force to deal with emergent changes in the operating environment.
While dealing with domestic pressures.
Precisely.
Reduce size, reduce
budget, et cetera.
Yeah.
If you can agree that that's the problem, then you can start developing. And some have said the cheapest thing to do is think. And it's true. So start with the development of the doctrine. Start with the concepts for how you're going to operate, and then let that drive your approaches to procuring technology, developing new equipment, new capabilities. And the good news is we're doing that. There's certainly not clear 100% agreement on the military problem. But I think if you make it less exclusive, in other words, it's not this or that. In this environment, it has to be this and that and that other thing. Then that, as messy as it is, gives you that sight picture.
Nice.
So to bring in, the idea of the Marine Corps maintaining its relevancy during the interwar period, to what extent was inter-service competition a driving factor behind the need to innovate and develop?
So the good news for the Marine Corps is battlefield success and great press. So an awful lot of so prior to World War I, and to a degree, one of the reasons why the Marine Corps was in France was because throughout the early part of the 20th century, really sort of in a nexus around 1910, was the first major debate about, do we need a Marine Corps? Can the Army do what the Marine Corps does for the Navy? Why does the Navy need an Army? We're sitting in the offices of the Marine Corps Gazette. One of the reasons the Marine Corps Association and the Gazette were created were to help the PR and also the intellectual underpinning to answer questions like that, which the other services already had. So take that environment. If we're going to be relevant, we got to be doing what everybody else is doing, and everybody else is fighting in Belgium and France. And so the Marine Corps participates as part of that U.S. American Expeditionary Force effort, and tremendous battlefield success built on rapid adaptation to what the French and British could teach them on the ground in France, and then I will say that good old Marine Corps spirit fighting against the Germans in places like Belleau Wood, and the Marines are just going to fight harder just because they're Marines, and they have better NCOs, and those NCOs had experiences in expeditionary operations in China and Central and South America, or Central America and the Caribbean, and so they were able to take those seasoned NCOs and tough Marines, and they pressed the fight with the Germans from Belleau Wood to Meuse-Argonne to Château-Thierry, all the battles we sing about. But we also had press with us, and so it was much easier for U.S. press to report on the Marines, vice this unit of the United States
Right.
Army. It was just more compelling.
Right.
And also the Marine leadership was more inclusive and welcoming to those combat correspondents, those war reporters. So the Marine Corps comes out of World War I with tremendous press and a real, high mark in the public's eye. And so combine that with, okay, we're not going back to Fort Leonard Wood or Fort Drum or Fort, wherever and circling the wagons and figuring out how to make tanks out of horses. We're in Cuba, we're in Haiti, we're in the Dominican Republic, we're in Nicaragua,
Yep.
and
Creating pulp fiction that's
yes,
going out.
and making sure you've got canned pineapples on your table.
Yeah.
And so there was the Marine Corps enjoyed some pride of place after World War I and capitalized on that. Going through the interwar period, absolutely there was competition, but there was also so much view of national necessity that the resources would eventually open up. Also, a recognition that reinvigorating the defense industry, which, as you pointed out earlier, were also all the other industries. Ford, DuPont, the precursors of some of our defense industrial base. Creating business for them employs people, helps to end the Depression. So it's sort of a left-handed jobs program. It's not the same as the Civilian Conservation Corps or the Tennessee Valley Authority, where the government is paying people to do work. They're creating business for these huge companies, to include U.S. Steel, Carnegie Mellon, all of, and now here's a boon to the environment. And so the resources were not as constrained because of that. I would tell you, I think resources are much more constrained now. Again, because there isn't necessarily that clear view of the threat and the future operating environment and what the military problem is. Right. So that answers the question.
No, that does. That's really a really fascinating discussion. So I really appreciate you coming in and learning us something today. And
always a pleasure.
Yeah, it was really great. And so, folks, thank you for tuning in. And to continue on with our Road to 250 series, please feel free to go to the Marine Shop and check out all of our cool merch and stuff that has to do with our Road to 250. And thank you for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
Scuttlebutt is a production of the Marine Corps Association. You have heard the voices or contributions from Major Vic Rubel, USMC retired, Nancy Litchman, William Truding, and our guest. Ty Frazier is the editor, sound engineer, and technical producer. The Marine Corps Association is not an agency of the U.S. government. The opinions expressed in this episode are the personal views of the participants and do not reflect the official position of the United States Marine Corps, the Department of Defense, or the Marine Corps Association.